Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the second subsession on better data for sustainable development. And I would like to ask you to take your seats, please. Can I ask those who don't want to stay in this room to leave it, please? On the gallery, please take your seats. Thank you very much. We will now begin the second subsession on better data for sustainable development. It will focus on data as a key enabler for achieving the SDGs. This subsession will bring together chief statisticians and other data and policy experts to review ways to increase country capacity and resources for data and statistics for the 2030 agenda. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists for subsession 2 on better data for sustainable development. But if you could be silent, please, because if not, our panelists will be not able to deliver their statements. Thank you very much. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists, Mr. Zachary Mwangi Chege, Chair of the United Nations Statistical Commission and Chief Statistician of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, Ms. Nancy Potok, Chief Statistician of the United States of America, and Ms. Shaida Badi, Managing Director and Co-founder of Open Data Watch. Our lead discussant is Ms. Risha Delatie-Budair, Deputy Director General of the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. And we have with us Ms. Emily Prayer, Executive Director of Data2X, who will moderate this session. Mr. Prayer, you have the floor.
Great. Well, welcome back, everyone. We have new panelists for you, but you still get to keep me. Hopefully, that's a good thing. I'm really looking forward to this conversation on better data on sustainable development, and turning to a topic that I think came up a few times in the discussion period. Really digging into what do we need also on the financing, the resourcing, and the partnership front to really accelerate progress on data and statistics in the SDG agenda. So with that, I will turn it straight over to Zachary Mwangi.
Thank you, Moderator, President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We are discussing about better data for sustainable development. And as an introduction, we note that the Sustainable Development Goals are the milestone marking the paths toward the future we want. Now, 3 years into the 2030 agenda, focus has shifted from defining what we want to achieve to how to measure progress. And with this shift comes a wave of new initiatives addressing the necessity of reporting on SDGs. The UN Statistical Commission was mandated to facilitate the follow-up and review process of the 2030 agenda. However, this mandate cannot be adequately accomplished without a coordinated improvement of national statistical system, especially since statistical capacity is not equally distributed. In the follow-up process, national statistical systems, and particularly national statistical offices, should play a central role as statistics produced by them ensures impartiality, reliability, and timelines. At the same time, they ensure a well-balanced approach to addressing the pledge of leaving no one behind. The UN Statistical Commission has tasked the high-level group for partnership, coordination, and capacity building with providing strategic leadership for the implementation process relating to the SDGs as it concerns statistical monitoring, reporting, and capacity building. And the high-level group has, through the Cape Town Global Action Plan, addressed this task and provided an overall framework for discussion, planning, implementation, and evaluation of statistical capacity building pertaining to the 2030 agenda. The Cape Town Global Action Plan emphasizes the work on statistical capacity building, which should be country-led and conducted in full consultation and coordination with national statistical offices. Highlighting some key challenges facing the statistical community, we note that there are data gaps, vast data gaps in measuring progress in implementation of the SDGs. And this is more pronounced in the poorest and least equipped statistical systems that are dependent on external support and struggle to produce the data needed to advance their societies. In these countries, the use of statistics by policymakers remain limited, leading to uninformed decision-making that generates poor development outcomes. National statistical systems, in particular in some least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing countries, are also trapped in a vicious cycle of statistical underdevelopment, where limited awareness and appreciation of the importance of data by policymakers and at all levels has led to sustained underfunding for statistics. In addition, lack of effective coordination of donor efforts and participation to increase the efficacy of current funding and assistance approach to capacity building remains also a challenge. Turning to some key successful experiences, we note that the Marrakech Action Plan for Statistics, adopted in 2004, targeted to support countries to prepare and implement national strategy for the development of statistics, NSDSs, and it was agreed or geared towards assisting countries to identify their statistical priorities and to develop coherent strategic plans. And a key lesson from this plan was that strategic planning was identified as a powerful tool in guiding the development of national statistical development programs, increasing political and financial support for statistics, and also ensuring that countries are able to produce the data and statistics needed for monitoring and evaluation of their development outcomes. Again, Chair, there are a number of statistical capacity building programs that have been implemented, noting key one, the statistical capacity building by the World Bank. We also have a program for resorts, financing model by also the World Bank. We also have various international statistical corporations, all aimed at ensuring that the national statistical systems are developed and able to meet international standards. Some of the recommendations and reflections, Madam Chair, is that political goodwill to champion the provision of adequate budgetary resources to support national statistical system in low-income countries to inform policy design and evidence-based decision-making is key. And Madam President, our participation in this high-level political forum to engage political leaders, share our experience and challenges is a very positive move. And in this regard, on behalf of the UN Statistics Commission, we appreciate the opportunity provided in having a whole session devoted to data and statistics. The UN Statistics Commission, through the high-level group, is currently developing a paper on framework addressing capacity building needs. Capacity development needs were identified by a survey that was jointly undertaken by the high-level group and Police 21. And in the survey, countries were asked to describe challenges, priorities, and plans they have for the short and the medium term. And building on the country's responses, statistical areas which require the most immediate capacity building were identified, and key among them include environmental statistics, statistics based on administrative sources, and disaggregation, particularly based on disability. Again, the paper has some preconditions for capacity building under this framework. And the preconditions proposed is that capacity building should be demand-driven and aimed at national statistical system. And regarding funding, a flexible approach where funding modalities will hedge on characteristics of individual capacity building initiatives is recommended. In addition, we also note that the framework requires that capacity building under this framework will address the statistics used for national decision making and also for the follow-up of the 2030 agenda. And secondly, the framework complements and does not replace other statistical capacity building initiatives. Again, finally, it is important to note that the paper is in draft form, and the ambition is that the final version will be adopted either shortly or at the World Data Forum in Dubai later this year. Now, it's my hope that we, during the World Data Forum, can tie the many elements of the current work on statistical capacity building together, and the ultimate goal would be an agreement including financial on the concrete mechanism to address statistical capacity. I thank you.
Thank you, Zachary. I'm now pleased to invite and turn the floor to Dr. Nancy Potok, Chief Statistician of the United States of America.
Thanks very much, and thank you to everyone here. I know it's been a long morning, and I think that if you're still here with us, either you had a very big breakfast or you agree that this is an important topic. And I hope it's the latter, but in any case, I'm glad that you're here and putting off lunch a little bit to share with us some of our thoughts and your thoughts on this. I think we've heard a lot this morning that we really need reliable, timely, accessible, objective, high quality, and easy to use data to provide insights to inform our decision making. I think you've heard that message a couple of different ways, because if we want to track progress on the SDGs, it requires kind of an unprecedented amount of data and statistics at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. And really, what I think our message is that we think a lot of that data ought to be derived from high-functioning official statistics produced by official statistical agencies. Why is that? I mean, there's a lot of data out there, right? We are swimming in data. And it's interesting how people start to think about data. Sometimes I'm with people who want to know the population of a country, or in the US, of a particular state, so they Google it. And then they turn around and say to me, see, we don't need the statistical agency, I can Google the information. And I'm like, where did you think the population number came from? It came from the Census Bureau, right? Like, there is just a lot of data, and it's hard to make sense of it, and it's hard to know what's true and what's not true, and what's objective and what's biased and not biased. So the key role that the national statistical offices play is to curate that data for you, because if the statistical offices really can stick to the principles and the practices that are out there for national statistical agencies, you will get objective, independent, unbiased data, whatever the original sources, whether it comes from a survey or a census or big data. That curation function, that turning of massive amounts of data into insights that you can either act on or not act on. I mean, I know this is a political body. Sometimes you don't want to act on it. Sometimes it's not a priority. But at least knowing what the information is really a key role of the national statistical agencies. So we have a lot of data. It's available from new and innovative sources. And these sources have steadily improved over the years. But still, we can see very clearly that worldwide statistical capacity needs strengthening. It is not sufficient yet. And the building of that capacity requires a coordinated effort. I think we've heard that too. The statistical agencies are not miraculously going to increase their capacity by themselves. And the governments can't do the whole job by themselves. It requires a partnership. It requires civil society. It requires private companies. It requires governments, and it requires the statistical agencies themselves all working in partnership. So in this very complex environment where we need to navigate data from all these different sources, we really want to have high quality data to understand what we're doing with sustainable development and make the National Statistical Office central to the effort. I think that's kind of our key message here. And, you know, the emphasis really is on high quality data. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the national statistical offices around the world have evolved over decades, sometimes hundreds of years. And there is a very mature framework out there for principles and practices, transparency, and something that I'm surprised I haven't heard about really this morning is protecting privacy. That's what statistical agencies do. That's something maybe corporations don't do as well. But the statistical offices are steeped in ethics and these principles and practices, and they are objective. And that's really key. You should want that information. You should want a source that you can trust that provides you insights. And, you know, I will say that also, you know, you want to know not only how well you're doing against the goals, but for planning future investments, these data can be really, really useful. You want to know where is the need? Where are the people? Where do you have gaps so that you can start to prioritize what the future investments are going to be, not just also saying, and here's how far we've come. And, you know, prioritizing future investments is a political decision, but it should be based on objective data. Presumably, at least informing what those decisions are. I mean, when you think about it, if you're still hesitant in any way of thinking that you would want these kinds of data, I mean, we've talked about businesses and corporations and how big and powerful they are. But can you imagine a corporation making investment decisions without good data? I mean, any business that's going to be successful has that information that is structured and key for them, for their growth, for their health, and to make investments. And why wouldn't a government do the same thing? Especially because the national statistical offices are there just for that purpose, to provide the information. So they already exist, but in many cases, the capacity really needs attention. And just to give you an example of kind of the scope of what I'm talking about, the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, otherwise known as Paris 21, recently did a survey with some partners, and it showed that only 17 countries, mostly in Europe and Northern America, have a fully funded national statistical plan. 11 of the countries are located in Europe and Northern America out of the 17. But that's your strategy for how you want to move forward with curating information that can guide these decisions. And then 37 out of 83 countries that responded to the survey had national statistical legislation in place that complied with the 10 fundamental principles of official statistics, which include objectivity, transparency, independence. That's not very many, really. In 25 countries did not conduct a population and housing census during the 2007 to 2016 period. How do you know what's going on with your population if you haven't conducted a census? And I will say, among the countries that were included in that group, 9 of them were in sub-Saharan Africa, 7 were in Northern Africa, and Western Asia. So we have a ways to go. Now, the news is not all bad. I'm actually quite optimistic when I look around, because sometimes it's a very simple type of change that can make a huge difference. And yes, we need a lot of investment globally, but sometimes you can just change small things and make a huge difference. So we have a lot of examples where countries, for example, Rwanda, just moved up the publishing date of their consumer price index by 5 days. And the data from their demographic and health survey and living conditions survey were released earlier. And so now they could start to be used in different ways and fed into Rwanda's first poverty reduction strategy. When the data are reliable, they can be put on platforms. There's lots of examples that I can go back to later. And, you know, sometimes it's just some assistance from another country and some sharing of technologies. So Lesotho was the first country in Africa to actually do a digital census on handheld tablets. And that allowed them to get their census data out in 1 year instead of 5 years. I mean, think about that, 5-year-old census data in today's world where people are moving and changing, and we have a goal of 2030. If you can get that data in a year simply by moving to tablets, and the U.S. Census Bureau helped with that effort, and the tablets can be shared, and other countries, Cameroon, Malawi, Ethiopia, South Africa, came to the training so that they could do the same thing. That is not an overwhelming barrier to improving the data and getting it out there. So with that, I would say that, you know, we really need to think about, again, working together, making these investments that sometimes are small investments, sometimes they're bigger, but really building up that capacity so that you have the information that you need in a way that you can use it to make these key investment decisions to meet the goals that we've set, that people have agreed to.
That's it. It's all been said. It's a small agenda that we are outlining here. We're not ambitious at all. So thank you so much for those comments, Nancy, and look forward to picking up some of these points later in the discussion section. I'm now pleased to introduce Delatie-Budair, who is Managing Director and co-founder of Open Data Watch. She is going to share some insights on financing data for the SDGs.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for the invitation and for being here. And sorry we've kept you so long talking about data, but you know, you all, as Nancy was saying, are heroes for being here at this hour. I'm going to talk about financing for data, and I think I have a presentation. Here we are. And the financing gap for the data demand of SDGs. I don't want to scare you. The number is not that big. It's just to say that we know a lot about the gaps in financing and some opportunities that we have for filling those gaps. So it's not going to be sort of a session where we talk about specifically what countries need to do for the financing, but it's sort of a global picture of where we are on financing. You've heard a lot, and we've seen from the work of the voluntary national reporting countries that data is recognize the importance of the data, but also some of the weaknesses in data system. But what I've been wondering is with this high demand for data, but also with the excitement for the data revolution, why we haven't really seen equivalent commitment for increased financing for data. So this is a puzzle that we have to collectively try to address. We've seen, if you look at behind the data and the demand for data, you've heard today a lot of data gaps, and some of these data gaps have been very, doing a lot of work behind the scene of calculating these data gaps. For example, the IEAG and the UN Statistical Commission, and a lot of work by CSOs and by international organizations in trying to see what these gaps are. And for example, 44% of the country worldwide do not have civil registration vital statistics system, which, as you know, is vital for the Leaving No One Behind agenda. And of course, the agenda for gender and for empowering women and girls is front and center to the SDGs. But so far, we only have 13% of the countries that have the dedicated budget for gender statistics. 37 countries have not done updating of the statistical systems according to the UN standards. And as you know, there are no data for 2/3 of the SDGs. So we're talking about serious gaps that we need to address for the SDG agenda. Looking behind the gaps, and don't get scared by this picture, it's not supposed to be scary, but it's just to say that looking behind the gaps, you see that there are a lot of as you heard from other colleagues, there are a lot of building blocks of the statistical system that need to be modernized. I always think of it as a house where you need to modernize it and you need to renovate it. You need to know first what you need to do. If you want to change the windows, if you want to fix the roof, if you want to change your plumbing system or add some new rooms to the house. So we're talking about this modernization of a statistical system, and there's a lot of work behind the scene that has identified what it takes to have a sustainable statistical system. So behind the demand, we saw gaps in data. And behind gaps in data, we saw that there is a lack of capacity, which is shown by this diagram. But then looking behind the capacity issues and the gaps issues, one of the things that stands out is lack of financing for data. And you all know that this is an element of this vicious cycle that we've been talking about. If you don't have sufficient funding, then there's poor production of poor quality of data, poor use of data, again feeding to even less funding. So funding is a big item for the SDG data agenda and to break the vicious cycle. As I promised you, we know the gap, and the gap is not that big. Today, I mean, based on the latest data that we have from ODA, we have $541 million that goes a year to statistics, which is 0.35 of the ODA. And based on our gap analysis, we know that we need $200 million more each year for SDG data agenda. This is, of course, an estimate based on lots of assumption and particularly based on the assumption that 50% of the financing needs is going to be financed domestically, and the rest, of course, for internationally for low-income countries, but for middle-income countries, of course, would be much more less commitments from the international sources. So 200 million, as I said, is not a large number. Compared with the trillions that you need for the SDG implementation, compared with billions that you need also for some of the modernization of sectors, and if you will, also compare it with the salaries of 2 soccer players or football players. And with that salary, we can actually fill this gap. I thought I'd add that since we're all in the middle of the World Cup. So if you think it's a big number, think of that. If we have 2 salaries of the football players, we are home and we can do the data work for the SDGs. So aside from more data, which you saw, we have the need that we have. Even more important than more financing. Aside from more financing, what's really needed much more is better financing for data. And in this slide, I'm trying to show one of the elements of the better financing is right in front of us, which is the Cape Town Action Plan. This is the action plan that's been endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission, by the countries, and you've heard it from my colleagues Zachary and colleague here, and Nancy, and it's going to be bringing most of the countries together on implementation of the agenda for 2030, and also is going to be a very important instrument for coordinating the financing for data. So the Cape Town Action Plan is really our action plan for going forward with this agenda. All that you've seen from the gaps in financing, gaps in capacity, gaps in data, they all may look daunting, and also the raising of the funding that we need. But I want to tell you that's one of the advantages of being an old person in the room is that you've been around a long time, and I've seen that it really works when the countries and when the international organizations come together from many of the previous experiences that I've personally been involved in. It does work, and we can mobilize the resources that we need. We did that largely for MDGs. We were late, but we did it, and we have many of the lessons from the past, like Marrakesh Action Plan, which Zachary mentioned in 2004, International Comparison Program, the 2010 census, when it was a groundbreaking census, bringing many countries and many agencies together to raise the resources that we need, and many other examples. So it could be done, in fact. So what does it take? Just bear with me. 4 blocks of things. The first one, and the most important one, if there's one thing you walk away with, is that first block, which is building political support for increased funding for data. And political doesn't mean some strange fellow somewhere as a politician. It means all of us. It has to be, all of us can actually be active in building the political support, whether you're a minister, whether you're a planner, whether you're a budget officer, and so on. And the second thing is the increasing domestic financing, which I think is front and center, and I don't need to build the case for it. But I say one more thing on the third block, and then I stop there, which is demonstrating the value of data. And that is also a responsibility for all of us of showing, using the data, making an impact with data, and actually demonstrating and sharing that value. So finally, when we come back here, of course, in 2018 we are, but 2019 and beyond, I really hope that we can see that we have moved the needle on this issue, the issue of financing for data, because by paying more attention to financing at the global and domestic level, I think we have really come forward to say that we are committed to the SDG agenda, because without the data, we really cannot have a SDG 2030. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shada, for that realistic portrayal, but still optimistic about what we can all do together. Although in terms of closing the financing gap, one comment on the football players, I think you mean, the male soccer and football players could make up that gap, probably not the female ones. But now I will turn to our lead discussant, Ms. Leisha Delatie-Budair, who is the Deputy Director General of the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. Thanks, Leisha.
Thank you very much, Emily. I also hope that my inclusion on this panel goes a little bit to help to allay the earlier fear about the diversity of age groups on the panels. Thank you very much, panelists, for your very important interventions. I would just like to add that it is important to note that in the discussion around funding for statistics and data, that we have to recognize that this is an iterative process. So that it's not enough for us to fund the production of statistics at one point during this 15-year agenda, but that we have to understand that the SDG indicator framework and the production of information has to be mainstreamed into global, regional, and national statistical programs, and that the appropriate and sustainable financial, human, and technical resources must be allocated to ensure effective monitoring of progress towards the goals. It also means that special efforts must be made to strengthen statistical capacities and improve financing for statistics in small island developing states, least developed countries, developing countries, and other vulnerable economies to ensure that no country is left behind on the road to 2030. To borrow a little bit from the Cape Town Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development data, there is a statement that says that this will entail the concerted and sustained accounting and coordination of existing efforts and strategic investments of resources in order to significantly address existing gaps in the technical and institutional capacities of national statistics systems and thereby improve the coverage, quality, and frequency of data and statistics made available through transparent and public access. There are a couple of things that this statement highlights. One, that we have to improve the technical capacities of our national statistics offices. Additionally, that we have to be strategic in the investment in statistics. There's also the mention of the need to strengthen institutional capacities and that we have to pay attention to how we disseminate information to the public. It is essential that also in the discussion around financing for statistics, that we take into consideration the situation of heavily indebted countries and vulnerable economies and the fact that their ability to mobilize domestic resources is constrained. I take note of a slide that was presented by Open Data Watch on the allocation of funding to statistics in 2015 and the fact that there was low allocation of funding to particular regions. For example, in the Caribbean region that comprises mostly of SIDS, there was very low funding that was allocated there. We're considered to be a middle income region, but there should also be the recognition of the fact that domestic resources are constrained by high debt. So it is important in the discussion around funding for statistics that we're discussing the expansion of non-debt creating financing. And that is important because if we are providing financing that creates more debt, it runs counter to the objective of sustainable development. Additionally, there's also the need to improve the underlying data systems. In many developing countries, there is the issue that the administrative data systems are manual, they're on paper. It's not digitized. So if we're trying to capitalize and maximize the use of administrative data, then we also have to have a discussion around digitizing the administrative data systems so that we can maximize the use of these systems for statistical purposes. Additionally, we have to recognize that the utility of the data is maximized through its use. So it's not enough for us to invest in producing the data, but we also have to invest in the dissemination of the data to make it more understandable and accessible by all, and that we also have to improve the communication around data and to improve the data literacy of our users. So I have a few questions for our panelists. One, how would you recommend that we mobilize funding for statistics in vulnerable economies? For example, in the Caribbean region, we live annually with the threat of hurricanes that will constrain the ability to mobilize domestic resources. How do you propose, or do you have any thoughts on how we can mobilize funding for statistics in vulnerable states? Additionally, within many statistical offices across the globe, there is a deficit of certain specialized skills. For example, not all statistics office will have, let's say, a sampling statistician. How then can we strategically invest in the building of capacities such as these scarce skills that we can capitalize on in smaller statistical offices? For example, one suggestion that I've heard discussed before is establishing regional centers of excellence so that we have shared resources in terms of technical capacity. What are your thoughts on suggestions such as this? Another question that I have is, how do we mobilize funding for institutional capacity building? For example, a very simple thing that we may need to discuss is the restructuring of many statistics offices to respond to the needs of the Sustainable Development Goals. How can we prioritize such a discussion as this? Because before we even get to the production of data, we need to have the capacity to produce the data. So institutional strengthening is very important. And my final question for the panel is, there is the recognition that in the whole monitoring and evaluation of progress towards the goal, that the production of statistics is only one component. There is also the need to develop monitoring and evaluation systems so that we can effectively monitor progress towards the goal. How do we mobilize funding for a broader M&E framework for the SDGs? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leisha, for those questions. I think we would need a whole other panel to just discuss those. They're fantastic questions. So I've been asked to open the floor earlier this time, and so I'm going to open it now, and we'll start taking those questions and comments. Again, let's try to limit them to 2 minutes, because I'd love to also be able for the panelists to respond to Leisha's questions as well. So first, I recognize the delegate from Kenya.
Thank you, moderator. Let me thank the presenters for their very good presentations. I have a question from Madam Shaida, and probably for all the presenters. Madam Shaida has told us that there is no data that exists for 2/3 of the SDGs because of either capacity of the statistical offices or also due to funding. Now we know that time is ticking and the year 2030 is not very far. So do we have a time frame when mechanisms for collecting this data will be made available? And this should include the finalization of the pending work of Tier 2 and Tier 3 indicators. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So maybe what I'll do is I'll collect these, and then if we have time at the end, we can answer. Hopefully we will. So next, I recognize the delegate from Denmark.
Thank you very much. I'm from Statistics Denmark, and I think this has been a very important session. I hope everybody takes note of what has been said here, because it's super important for what we are going to do. We need to be ambitious, it's said, but we also need to have a strategic plan for what we actually want to prioritize. Nancy said that we have heard several times that we need high quality data, easy access to data, and easy data to use. The thing is, we still need a lot of actually basic data. And I think that needs to be addressed too. Coming from Denmark, it's kind of nice to come here every year to be heralded by the Bertelsmann Index. We are always in the top 10, together with our neighboring countries and a few other countries in Europe. But actually, it's not the issue. We need to turn the Bertelsmann Index the upside down and look maybe at the countries at the end of the index. Can anybody remember who they are? Everybody can remember that Denmark and Sweden and Finland and blah, blah, blah is in the top. But nobody can actually remember that a lot of sub-Saharan countries is in the bottom. My friend from Congo here, Benin and others. So we need to focus on the issues that they have. And I guess from official statistics, we can do a lot for less than the 90 billion that Jeffrey Sachs was mentioning. We are actually quite cheap in achieving results that are super important. Now, Nancy said that she was optimistic. I like to be optimistic. So therefore, I would like to ask Zachary, how does optimism look like seen from an African perspective? Thank you.
Thank you. I now have a representative from an NGO, whoever from the NGO major group. Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks to these two panels for highlighting some innovative practices in terms of measurement of the SDGs. Unfortunately, many of the efforts we are seeing are not so good. It is crucial that data and monitoring gives due weight to all the aspects of the agenda, is placed in context and doesn't lose the forest for the trees. it also has to be channeled into processes for accountability and for policy change. Quality official data is critical, but we also need to recognize that all data has power dynamics embedded in it, even in the choice of what we measure in the first place. There is a wealth of insightful data available from civil society and NGOs around the world, including data that is gathered in empowering and participatory ways. It would be a huge mistake not to use it. We'd like to make a couple of comments about one of the major compendiums of SDG data, the Secretary General's Progress Report. While we applaud the efforts of the UN Statistics Division, the report has some major flaws that must be remedied in future if it is to accurately monitor implementation and spur more effective action. The progress report has huge gaps, missing out many targets, even ones with Tier 1 indicators, and is almost entirely devoid of contextual analysis of global trends. This results in a very skewed and misleading picture and risks invisibilizing some of the most essential elements of the SDGs, including those most closely linked with human rights. As a simple but powerful action point, we urge the UN to lift the word limit on the progress report, absurdly not much more than 10,000 words for a report purporting to cover 169 targets for the whole planet, and therefore allow a much more detailed, nuanced, and rich picture of what we are doing right and where we are way off track. Unfortunately, the experience of civil society shows that for the most part we are way off track. The NGO Major Group Position Paper signed by over 100 organizations says, for the SDGs to be truly transformative, urgent action is required to restructure global systems to orient them towards equity and justice. We hope that the 2018 HLPF will be the moment when a critical mass of governments realize the scale and urgency of the task ahead and commit to real action towards what they promised in the 2030 Agenda, transforming our world. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize the delegate from Italy.
Thank you. The statistical system is called upon to take decisive actions to transform how data and statistics are produced and disseminated, to inform development policy decision with the vital support of governments and in closer partnership with the national statistical offices, but also international partners, stakeholders from academia, civil society, the private sector, and the public at large. This will entail the concerted coordination of existing efforts and the strategic investment of resources in order to significantly address existing gaps in the technical and institutional capacities, and thereby improve the coverage, quality, and timeliness of data and statistics. The role of coordination and cooperation among countries, regional organizations, and other international organizations is crucial in carrying out statistical capacity building efforts in their areas of work. In the Cape Town Global Action Plan is clearly mentioned the efforts to strengthen national statistical systems and the coordination role of national statistical offices. As specific action, it is important to conduct needs assessment of national statistical capacity and an assessment of available resources to address those needs, including those related to technical cooperation, training, and sharing of best practices offered by countries. The efforts on capacity development has to be also devoted to reinforce governance and institutional frameworks, but also to modernize statistics to allow national statistical systems to meet the demands and opportunities of constantly evolving data ecosystems. Investing in statistical systems must become a strategic priority and their development cooperation partners alike. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Recognize the delegate from South Africa.
Thank you, Chairperson, and we would like to echo the message of the panelists on the Cape Town Global Action Plan and call for support for the United Nations World Data Forum initiative as it proceeds to Dubai. We would like to also emphasize the need for financing mechanisms in support of quality for data as well as official and other statistics, especially in strengthening cooperation in technology in statistical development. Chairperson, the post-2015 development agenda in the form of SDGs enjoins us all to uphold the notion of common but differentiated responsibility for humankind. South Africa would therefore want to call upon an opportunity and space to be created and given to developing nations on matters SDGs. This would aid the process of domestication of indicators, especially, Chairperson, in an environment where systems and institutions are still equally developing. I thank you.
Thank you. Our last delegate is from Switzerland, and then I will be turning it over to our panelists to respond to these insightful questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm very happy to hear that we are all a bit convinced that we have to invest in statistical capacity building and that it is needed to invest in there. So I'd like to share with you important information on ongoing work that is actively supported by Switzerland. As you may know, the OECD DAC report in 2017 covered the topic development data. A number of recommendations were made there. And the OECD DAC is still working on strategies, good practices to provide the data divide for development. Secondly, the annual meeting of the Partnership Group, Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, also called and already mentioned PERI 21, decided to conduct a study to tackle the question of funding a bit more detailed. This exploratory study on the existing needs and financing mechanism for development data will also cover the question of the feasibility of creating a global fund for development data. The work is ongoing and a first presentation of the study will be presented in Dubai in October at the second UN World Data Forum. We are convinced that the different approaches needed to be discussed soon to guarantee the sustainable funding that supports the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we actually have one more commenter. I recognize the delegate from Bahrain.
Thank you, Madam. اسمحوا لي أتكلم بالعربية لغتي.
If you don't mind, I'll speak in Arabic. We believe that it is key to call for the use of statistics from unknown sources or little-known sources, or from national offices. In national offices, criteria are adopted to respect the statistical goals of the United Nations from a legal standpoint and from a procedural standpoint. And that is to promote confidence among the users of the data and to preserve the rights of the researchers. So any request to use statistics from non-official sources, then those sources must also respect the criteria established by the United Nations. That is for the general use of statistics for projects. Thank you.
Thank you. And in the meantime, we had one more come up. I recognize the delegate from El Salvador. That will be our last comment, and then we'll turn it to the panelists. Thank you. The list is closed now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor. I just have a few technical comments to make. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in statistics at all. I'm a diplomat here in New York. But in terms of our national efforts, just a few weeks ago, we have updated our internal, our domestic statistical tool, at least in the short term. But this is an endemic issue, the collection of data for all developing countries. And from a political standpoint, I welcome the comments made by the representative of Denmark. As much as our northern partners may be pleased about this, they are often north of the, above the statistical averages. But obviously the issue of visibility is not just a political one, it's a technical one as well. And in order to climb up in the list of statistical data, then we need to have data which shows us that we're moving forward with the indicators. And for those countries that are at the bottom of the list, you can see that there's a major correlation between the statistical capacities of those countries and their achievement of the SDGs. The truth is, you don't know whether or not they're progressing. Perhaps they are progressing, but we just can't measure it properly. And in the latter case, if they are indeed making advancements, but we just can't measure it statistically, then what would Plan B look like while we continue to work on improving our statistical compilation nationally? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, and also just to say that you don't have to be a statistician to be in this conversation. It's we're very welcome. This is the high-level political forum, so this is actually the point, to have this type of exchange between those who are in data and statistics and those who are working as policymakers. So thank you for your comments. So now I have the easy job, they have the hard job right now, because I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We have quite a slate of questions to consider. So rather than me assigning them to you, I'm going to leave it to you to choose, and then you can take it up with the people whose questions you didn't answer later. No, but if I will just go in the order in which we began. And so Zachary, if we can start with you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator, and thanks for the excellent interventions. And how do we mobilize funding, particularly for the small island and vulnerable economies? I think, for me, the issue of the policy leaders should recognize that funding the modernization of the national statistical system is the key to ensure that we implement the SDGs. So domestic funding is critical, and also continuous engagement of the policy makers so that we ensure that this is done. Again, there is the technical cooperations, particularly in our country. We have technical cooperation with some countries, like Statistics Sweden. We are also to engage in technical cooperation with the UK National Statistics Office. Again, these are efforts that are geared toward modernization. Again, the US Census Bureau also has also provided us with a lot of support, more so to do with the population and housing census. So this kind of cooperations do pay to modernize the statistical organizations in our countries. The other issue about even looking at the deficit in the skills, the sharing of experiences, sharing of resources, for example. When some countries in Africa were doing or started doing the digital census, they got resources from other countries, the south-to-south kind of cooperation, and this helps. Again, in Africa, we have a peer review mechanism where countries visit other countries and peer review and establish the gaps. and they help in bridging some of the gaps. So we are very optimistic, as my friend wanted to get. How optimistic are we? Because in Kenya, for example, in terms of the SDGs, we have identified like 128 indicators that we are reporting on. We also have a very vibrant non-state actors in the data ecosystem. And the issue is, how do we better coordinate? I think the whole issue is the issue of coordination, because there is the will, and if we work together as a team, I'm very sure that we are going to make data available. And I want to believe that my friend from Bahrain, the whole issue is that it should be within the principles, the fundamental principles of official statistics, even when we are looking at the other data sources. So I'm very optimistic that as a statistical community, we have a very elaborate framework. We have the the Cape Town Global Action Plan. If we get resources so that we can mainstream this global action plan into our regional plans and even into our national plan, I see light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you. Turn it to Nancy next.
Thanks. Is this on? Yes, okay. Yeah, so I agree with Zachary. You know, I think that, but I also agree with several of the comments that were made, that there is a need to invest in many parts of the world in just the basics. Just getting the censuses done and the data disseminated on time to be useful is key. And I think that's why we've worked very closely together, U.S. and Kenya, and U.S. and other countries, to get the censuses done and to bring technology. Why am I optimistic about this? Because I think, you know, in some countries we struggled for a long time to modernize, to learn what we know. But I think there's some real opportunities here just to leapfrog. You know, why not move in, you know, why do you have to go through that kind of learning process and sort of start at the midpoint of the last century in terms of how we do surveys and censuses when we're in the digital age? And so I think having the stable funding, and that means, you know, bringing in not only governments and doing, as Zachary suggested, which is building this into the plans. You know, you get a lot of return on investment there. And that's it, you know, recognizing that is key. So building that into the country plans, but also bringing in the civic organizations and the foundations and others that we've mentioned to have money to set up kind of a, you know, sustained long-term umbrella type of funding mechanism to really sort of get those basics in place. Leapfrog where you can, so that the progress can actually be much faster than some of the other countries have made, because you can share equipment, you can share knowledge, you can share training, you can move specialists around in the world. If a country doesn't have a specialist, they can come from somewhere else and help and train people. So it takes planning and cooperation, motivation, a will to do it, and enough money, which is relatively small in the total scheme of things, for how much money you actually need to achieve the SDGs to measure your progress and how you're doing it. I think that's why we're optimistic. We can see that it's doable. So we just need to get busy and get it done and get the right parties together to do it.
Thank you for those reflections, Nancy. And Nancy and Zachary, I wonder if you could also respond. You know, Leisha did such a wonderful job kind of summarizing the comments and really considering her questions in advance of today's discussion. And I'm wondering if you could both maybe make a brief comment on what you think of her suggestion around, for smaller NSOs, you know, what are some of the answers, you know, to kind of help us leapfrog some of this and take advantage of some shared experiences. You know, is the answer regional centers of excellence? Is it something else? Would love to hear both of your perspectives on that.
I tend to believe that also establishing regional centers of excellence would also help a lot where information is shared. And again, as Nancy has mentioned, sharing resources, because sharing personnel, having technical assistance, advisors, even in countries, it doesn't cost a lot. I think we should remain very, very optimistic that it is doable, and it has been done. It has also been tested in other countries, and it has worked.
This idea of centers of excellence, it's a good idea. I guess my caution on that would be you don't want centers of bureaucracy. Creating more institutions outside of the official institutions that already exist is probably not necessarily the best investment. However, as Zachary pointed out, finding ways to share efficiently, finding, for example, the statistical organizations around the globe who maybe are particularly good at certain things. So I would say more information sharing than actually creating organizational structures where people can connect and share what they know, get training or do training. But sometimes it can be, just connecting two countries that want to work together can be a very efficient way of doing this and have a big multiplier effect. So I don't know that centers of excellence would be the way to go, but I do think that having information about who's good at what and who's willing to share that in some way with other countries, whether it be the technology, the equipment, the platforms, the methodologies, is a really good idea that we could build on.
Great. Thank you for circling back on that. And for our last panelist, Shada, I wonder if you could answer a couple of the questions on resourcing, and particularly resourcing in vulnerable contexts as well. Thank you.
Yes, on the resourcing in small and vulnerable contexts, my experience has been it's really very important to treat that as a sort of a collective action that's needed. At the national level, there's a responsibility for good planning through the National Strategy for Development Statistics, and use that instrument of planning to bring together the international actors and international support groups together. And then come up with sort of the ways which actually suits the country and really puts the country in the driver's seat, but suits the country, but brings the donors together around the table and around that national strategy for development of statistics. For example, for bringing experts or providing, there's a lot of opportunities for seconding expertise. There's a lot of opportunities for different modalities for training staff and sharing experience. So it's not only resource transfer that works for supporting country. It could be also a transfer of knowledge and transfer of expertise. So I'm all for the planning, for using NSTS and actually bringing the donors around that instrument. There was, Emily, there was one of the questions for me on the gaps for SDGs and what's the trajectory for the 2030 agenda. And I just wanted to emphasize that in terms of the technical work of the tiers of the 3 tiers of the SDGs and trying to sort of sort out the methodologies, we have a very, very important infrastructure in place, which is the interagency and expert group on SDG, reporting to the UN Statistical Commission with a very capable leadership of the UN Statistics Division, and is very sophisticated action plan and work program that's been put together for dividing the responsibilities among different international organizations and experts of how to go about different methodologies that needs to be sorted out. So it's not, this is not chaotic. This is really well organized and very well handled. It's really the responsibilities then at the national level for the implementation and for raising the domestic resources that we're talking about. I think the question was also hinting at what is the cost of inaction if we don't act in filling those gaps at the national level. And I think that's a question that we all have to ponder and think about. But for me, the cost of inaction is going to be quite high because we would put a lot of decisions based on proxy numbers or some of the numbers that we've seen that comes from not very viable sources. So cost of inaction in terms of not filling those gaps at the national level and supporting the statistical system for me is quite high. There was one other comment from my colleague from El Salvador. I just wanted to mention that there was a hint that you have to be in a high-income country to be a high-capacity country for development data and statistics. And actually, some of our data shows that that's not true. You don't have to be a high-income country. You could be a middle, even low-income country and have a very well-functioning statistical system, producing the national data needs, being independent, being trusted, and producing the SDG data that's needed. So it's not really, you don't have to be high income to be a good data producer. I just wanted to end with that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists who you've given us so much to think about, so much to aim for, and also to be optimistic about as well, which I really appreciate. I'll just make a few quick observations as we close out. One is that by doing a quick count of this panel and our preceding panel, it feels like the future face of data and statistics is female. So we'll also aim for increasing gender parity on some future panels. Second is that the constitution of everyone in this room is really quite amazing. Everyone I've been kind of watching and looking at your faces. Thank you to those of you who smile at me. It's very encouraging when you sit up somewhere for 3 hours to have happy people looking at you. So really appreciate your time and attention and thoughtfulness. Third is that, as I listen and absorb the conversations from this morning, this work on really realizing how we produce and analyze and use data for implementation of the SDGs is obviously complex. It's interrelated. We have to both increase resources, but we also have to use what we have in a smart way. It's really going to require a certain wiliness and cleverness on, I think, all of our parts in order to do so. But I think that, really this group, if your presence here is any indication, is really up for that challenge. The other thing I wanted to observe is that, the data and statistics agenda and the insights agenda, to use what Padraig said earlier, it's not only about the agenda of the people who, come up on this panel and other panels who might talk about data and statistics. It's everyone's agenda. Anything that we want to be achieving collectively around the SDGs, it is not only a technical agenda, it's a political agenda, and it's a through line. Data and statistics is a through line for every ambition that we have on both tracking our progress and planning future investments. So I think this is a really important opportunity to be here at the high level political forum, really taking this message out there and having all of you and asking and inviting all of you to take that messages to your own missions and to your own organizations to really ensure that we have the data and statistics capacity that we need to track progress on the SDGs, and hopefully in 2030 really start to celebrate some achievements. So many thanks to all of you. I hope some of you will join us for a conversation that will be going on in October at the UN World Data Forum in Dubai. Registration closes in July, at the end of July 31st, I believe. So get your registration in. I hope to see you there. I will be there. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. And Madam President, I turn it back over to you.
I thank our moderator for skillfully moderating our debates and our distinguished panelists for their insightful contributions. I like the general balance of this panel too. It is nothing against you. I would like to thank all delegations and all representatives from stakeholders for being with us this morning and for your active involvement and participation.